and welcome to this panel, which I'm chairing. I've heard quite a lot has already come up in terms of test and learn, so I'm delighted to be talking about it further. How we are going to structure this session, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes sort of framing what we're doing at Google, giving you some examples of how we think about it at Google. I'm then going to invite my wonderful panel of two, perfectly formed panel of two, Andrew and Lawrence, onto the stage. And then there's also going to be an opportunity for you to ask any questions. So there's going to be a roving mic in the audience. So think throughout the afternoon about what questions you want to ask. So thinking about Google and how we think about test and learn, which is very much a core part of our DNA, there are three things I want to talk about. Firstly, a business perspective. Secondly, from a product perspective. And thirdly, from a leadership perspective. So business. This time last year, I remember receiving an email from our CEO, Sundar, talking about the launch of Alphabet, and I was completely baffled about what it meant. But clearly, it was a very wise and strategic decision, and it was essentially about two things. One was splitting out our core internet services under Google, and by that I mean companies like Google Search, Play, Android, those sorts of companies. And the second was splitting out the newer companies. And this was really to allow freedom and innovation for companies like Google X, who are behind driverless cars, and Loom, and those incredible innovations, Fiber, Google Ventures, and also a company called Verily. So hands up if you've heard of Verily. Any of you heard of Verily? 3 hands have gone up who know what Verily is. Well, what it does is it uses technology to really improve human health. And this picture here, does anyone know what that is? Anyone see what it is? Smoke alarm. Smoke alarm. It looks very like a smoke alarm. What it actually is, it's a smart contact lens. So, so Verily have been working with pharmaceutical companies, and for this they've actually been working with Novartis to create a smart contact lens which can detect from tears the level of glucose, which can obviously assist people who are suffering from diabetes. So this is a project that's underway at the moment, which Verily are leading with Novartis, and one of a number of projects that they're undertaking. They're also working with other pharmaceuticals in the areas of MS and also cancer as well. So that's really what Alphabet has enabled us to do, really thinking about kind of test and learn at the core of our companies. Secondly, from a product perspective, this is our starting point from everything. So focus on the user and all else will follow. We have a kind of philosophy called 10 things we know to be true, and ultimately it's all about the user. So everything that we do is this constant kind of testing and learning based on what our users want and how they're responding. So how this works in practice is kind of in 3 areas. One are goals. So we talk a lot about setting these big, audacious goals. We talk a lot about moonshotting in 10x. And when I came, my background was media and creative agencies. And when I got to Google, all these kind of like acronyms and terms and moonshotting and 10xing was kind of all a bit much. But actually at the heart of it, it's brilliant because we set very, very clear goals, company, country, team, down to the individuals, and we call them OKRs, objectives and key results. So we all, as individuals, have them, which we track on a quarterly basis. So we have our big, audacious, long-term goals, but there's this constant looking at what we're doing on a quarterly basis as well, all the way down to an individual basis. And we have a lot of company meetings. We have big all-hands, TGIF, thank Google it's Friday, obviously, where Larry and Sergey, our leaders, actually still run those meetings, which is incredible. So on a weekly basis, you're just hearing about the kind of the company focus and how we're doing against our goals. Which leads me on to the second point, which is really about that pace. The pace of work in a tech company is quite phenomenal because it's rapid fire. And again, that was very different to my background of working probably on more of a kind of annual planning basis, coming from an agency and client side. And then the third point here is sunsetting, which I'd never heard sunsetting used as a verb until I got to Google. And essentially what it means from a business perspective is when something is intentionally phased out or discontinued or terminated. And we do this all the time at Google. we're constantly looking at what we've created and looking at whether or not something needs to be sunsetted or not. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second. So, a couple of examples of how this actually plays out from a product perspective. Obviously, everyone knows what this is, but if you think back to 2004 when it was launched, there was actually very little email, which is quite mad to think that 12 years ago we kind of weren't really using email. I remember I was working for a digital agency at the time, and because what we did was we did this kind of beta of only 1,000 people were invited to have a Gmail account. They were hot property. So actually, people were kind of, spending hundreds of pounds to actually buy a specific Gmail account. But the reason that we did it wasn't about driving kind of auction intensity on eBay. It was actually all about launching small and constantly iterating. So we started with 1,000. Those influencers were then allowed to invite other families and friends. And as we were scaling out, we were constantly iterating and improving the product. And obviously, what that is now is Gmail, and it's absolutely huge and a big part of a lot of our lives. The second example I want to show you is, anyone recognise this? No one at all? Come on, Lawrence. Wave, exactly. So Wave was launched in 2009 at I/O, which is our big developer conference, which we have every year in San Francisco. And it was a real-time messaging platform. That was kind of like how it was framed. And it was very popular. It was very popular for particularly kind of engineers and people who worked in the tech and digital space. But a year later, we decided to sunset it. And the reason we did that was because it hadn't hit our goals, and we didn't see it having the scale that we'd set the ambition for it. So we decided to sunset it. But the big thing that we did here, and this is something that we do loads at Google, is that we strip out the bits of it that actually work really well. So for any of you who use G Suite kind of apps, docs, slides, calendar, all of those fantastic features, I certainly couldn't live without slides, those actually all came from Wave. So that's often what we do, and we've done that with Google Class as well, is just taking the aspects and the features of it that we can incorporate into other products. And so finally, the last area I wanted to talk about from a sort of test and learn perspective was all about leadership. This is the Cynefin model. Anyone heard of the Cynefin model? Anyone Welsh here? I probably pronounced it wrong. No one at all. So what the Cynefin model does is, I'm not going to go into it in a huge amount of detail. There is a 10-minute YouTube video, which I would encourage you to watch, which talks about it in more detail. But it talks about different phases of decision-making, from the kind of ordered to the unordered. And on this scale here, the simple and complicated, there's a lot of cause and effect, and it's much easier to predict what the solutions are going to be. It's much easier from a leadership perspective to actually manage those situations. However, increasingly, our world is up in the complex. Contemporary businesses are so much more complex than they ever were before, and that requires a different leadership mentality. And there are two aspects of it that we, at a kind of UK leadership level, adopt. The first is, for these complex decisions, you really need smaller teams. You need a maximum of 6 people to actually make these decisions. So it's rather than having a big crew of people who are trying to tackle it together, it's having a much smaller team. And the second part of it is running these safe-to-fail experiments. So constantly working out, what are the safe-to-fail experiments that you can work? What do you want them to achieve? And also, if they don't achieve them, what's the dampening strategy, or what's the amplification strategy if they are very successful? So this is something that we adopted at leadership level, which is a really fantastic way of looking at different scenarios and how we really need to tackle them. So, before I introduce the panel, I just want to conclude, for every Gmail and photos, we've had a Google wave. You know, we sunset things, we terminate products a lot, but we're constantly looking at what are the features and the applications and what are the learnings that we can take out of it. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce my panel of 2 up onto the stage. So firstly, Andrew Warner, do you want to come up now? So Andrew, who's leading, an experienced marketeer, senior positions at BBC, Microsoft and Sony and Expedia. You regularly see him on the top 100 marketing lists. He's won a whole kind of bookshelf of awards, including 19 Cannes Lions and the Effectiveness Lion as well. And we are incredibly lucky for him to be here because he's currently VP of EMEA Marketing for Monster. They were actually sold yesterday. I thought it was a joke, Monster being sold on Halloween, but no. They were sold yesterday, and he should be meeting his new boss now, but he's on the IPA panel, so thank you very much. And also Lawrence Webber, who is Managing Partner of Innovation at Karmarama. And he was very upset when he was writing his bio and realised that he'd been working for 17 years. He is going to be 40 this year. He's worked for a fantastic range of agencies like Brooklyn Brothers and Work Club across a fantastic range of clients. He's also a big player in the industry. He does a huge amount for the IPA. I first met Lawrence. His dedication, my dedication to the IPA, was we went on the first delegation trip to South by Southwest in 2012. It was hard, but we did it though, yeah. We did it, exactly. And he's also very involved in Beamer, our Creative Council, Unilever Foundry, and also Friday Club. So, a massively warm welcome to you both. I'm going to sit down as well. So firstly, a question to you both. I've explained kind of why I'm passionate about this topic. It's a big part of our DNA at Google. Why are you passionate about it? And you go first.
I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it is I love the use of the word veteran, experience. It basically means we're old. And I suppose I was a classically trained marketeer, and one of the things which makes me really angry is because I started out in the industry before the internet was a thing, and when you read sort of articles by people like Ritson, there's always like this assumption that people who work in digital marketing don't understand the basic principles of marketing. But for me, test and learn has always been part of marketing. Since the early days, I started out in direct marketing, and testing was always a big thing. Kotler was always talking about targeting and understanding your audience being the really key thing. And for me, test and learn is kind of just the modern evolution of that. And if you think about sort of where we are today, really, and this is where Richmond starts saying, oh, he's just a digital marketeer wanging on about the technology. But stuff like, data storage is cheaper than ever. Processing power is higher than it's ever been before. Digital media does mean there's more touch points, more measurable contact points than there's ever been before. And when you add into things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, one of the things that's possible now is you can just run hundreds of tests in a year without having to scale your head count 100 times. It's cheap, it's effective. In short, really, the technology and the economics kind of make sense now for you to be able to really leverage this. And if ultimately, your company isn't culturally adjusted to it. And when I was at Expedia, like Google, we used to have a massive test and learn culture, sometimes frustratingly so, kind of, what's the weather like today? Let's run a test and figure out what the answer is. But the reality was we accepted that about 2/3 of tests would fail. That was kind of what we just accepted as a norm. We didn't mind retesting. Culture, that'd be quite difficult. But now we are in a place whereby if that's not your company culture, there are now test and learn organizations where you can leverage someone else's cloud, you can leverage someone else's structure to be able to run test and learn stuff for yourself, something like ThinkSprint. So
let's come back. Come back to that, because I think that's fascinating. ThinkSprint. So, firstly, Lawrence, why are you passionate about it?
I guess partly because I'm old enough to have started in a digital agency when digital agencies were kind of the people that sat at the very end of the table whilst the other agencies dictated how things worked. But I was always very interested in the way technology was going to change things. And I think now what I'm passionate about, but also sometimes slightly angry about, is that we've now got a situation where technology and data should be driving creativity, or should be an equal partner to it. And I don't think that that's necessarily borne out in the work that the industry is seeing, or even in how some agencies are structured. I still think there's a clinging on by some agencies and some marketeers to the kind of the unreasonable power of creativity, which I think it has. But don't think it has that without backing up with data and technology. So kind of passionate about finally bringing those things together.
So still a huge amount of
Yeah,
potential.
and I think it's based on it's pragmatism.
Yeah.
The world is so defined by data and technology that it's time that we kind of define the work we do by it as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So what do you see then really as the main benefits as a marketeer for Test and Learn? You talk quite a lot already about the culture and having a culture of it. Why are some companies, like particularly companies like Expedia, why are they ahead of the game? So what are the benefits?
I think companies like Monster, Expedia, a lot of the digital companies, there's three tenets, and not all digital companies are good at test and learn. We'll talk about that probably in a bit. But for me, there's three things really it allows. Firstly, is bravery. I mean, Lawrence talked about sort of unreasonable power of creativity. I think often there's an assumption that kind of data and stuff around effectiveness and creativity and doing big, bold things are sort of polar opposites. And I think exactly the opposite, because I think it's Jim Collins, talks about how if you fire bullets before you fire cannonballs, you can test things out, you can actually de-risk things, you can get around some of the problems with things like market research where people talk about insight, but really if you're talking to consumers, you often talk about the here and now, buyers are liars, all the old cliches. Really what you want is foresight, build ideas, try things out, test them, see if they work, look for the trends, and if the time is not quite right, keep an eye on it, experiment and do it again. Transparency, I think, is another massive advantage. To be good at test and learn, and why companies like Expedia are probably quite good at it, I'm sure Google too, is that the data is kind of transparent. You don't have that sort of siloed knowledge is power thing between departments. And at Monster, actually, we've moved everyone to exactly the same data platform globally. So the numbers I'm working with are the same numbers the product guys have, the finance guys. It's all completely transparent. And that also then leads to creativity, because people do feel empowered. If you've got fairly flat structures and you've got shared information, and you're not sort of relying on a hierarchy for decision making, it allows you to move more quickly, it allows you to be braver. And I think one of the great examples at Expedia was when I was there, and you talked about kind of some of the awards we won, but actually the one campaign which won lots of awards, both for creativity and effectiveness, a senior manager, when he saw it, said to me, I think the quote was, apologies to those in the room who are sensitive, this is the biggest load of shit I've seen in my life, what a waste of money. And
is he still around?
He's still around.
He's still around, okay, no names.
No names.
He's not here.
Hopefully he's not here.
I can see him at the back.
But you were wrong. You were wrong. And
Exactly.
we did a test actually without him knowing, and we put the test out there, very scale thing, and then we built the data, we built the case, and actually we delivered something which was incredibly effectiveness, and that was working in partnership with our agency. And I think that's another thing which is tricky for the new generation of companies, is sometimes the agency cultures, and it took us a while to get our agency Ogilvy into a good place in terms of understanding how we work as a business to deliver that, and I think that's something else you've really got to work on.
I love it. We're going to have a fight on the panel.
So,
What does the agency person think then about how agencies can adapt in this kind of whole test and learn environment?
I think you raise a good point about different types of clients. So there's a slight tension when you work for clients that are inherently digital businesses. They have a lot of skills in-house that agencies would like to sell them. So they have people that are going to build their apps, they have data analysts, they have people that derive insight. And so if you don't adapt and you don't try and build a partnership with that client, you frankly become a production company. You receive insight from the insight department of the client, and they say, can you turn that into a witty ad, preferably with a celebrity in it, and send it to the media agency. And that's kind of, and so you have to kind of work out how you can build much more fluid teams. So for some clients, we have members of our data team, or the kind of data part of our business, that are essentially the kind of the senior client lead. So sometimes we will take data from a client, add our own third-party data or insight to it, and then write a creative brief. So other clients we work for is still quite traditional. It's still a client going, please tell me what my insight around this consumers can be, and then go and build me a piece of content or a TV ad, or in some cases now kind of go and build me a kind of a digital product around it. The hard bit is every client seems to have very different ideas of what they want to do in-house, and and leave to agency. So the model's got to be really flexible.
But what does that mean for the actual structure of the agency? Like, has that changed? So at Karmarama, do you still have creative, production, planning, suit departments? Or is there more kind of like less hierarchy and more fluidity?
So we still have departments, because I think there's kind of still specialisms, and, you know, frankly, you need someone to be hiring into departments and therefore be responsible for it and to manage that as a team in the business. But I think, to a point earlier, the kind of the lead on a piece of business sometimes might be the data team.
Right.
And frankly, the creative team will take a back seat, or sometimes it's our UX guys who lead a piece of work, and the creatives are just really asked to do almost do copywriting. And then we have another concept which we call Now and Next, which is, I'm not going to pretend it's anything like Google's model, but essentially there is a business of usual that you need to get into the rhythm of doing. Clients need to be happy that you're delivering effectiveness, and that, you know, the team that they are paying for is delivering what they said they would. And then we try and just stretch clients' horizons a bit. That could be, you know, innovation presentations, or it could be, you know, co-creating products with them.
Yeah.
I think it's important that agencies lead, otherwise increasingly you get swamped by the pace of what you need to develop, and then you become a production company, which is something we really don't want to become.
And it's interesting actually, because the way that you're talking about Karmarama, it sounds very much like a digital agency culturally and mindset wise, isn't it? Whilst, I mean, you're a creative agency.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point earlier, like, so much of it is the culture, isn't it? The culture everyone has to believe in this way of working. Otherwise, it doesn't work if it's just like siloed teams trying to do it. So what tips have you got then for anyone? Hands up who's a client in the audience. Clients, and how many agency people have we got?
Oh, look.
Oh, probably 2/3 agency. So what tips do you have then for marketeers then about how to deploy more of a test and learn strategy?
For marketers, I think one of the things which can be really frustrating, particularly for agency partners as well, is that sometimes test and learn always becomes like an excuse for not taking decisions, and it's not in itself a business strategy. It's not in itself a brand positioning. And the way I always I like to think apps. I think is quite a good metaphor, like the app Uber, or someone that's may have done it beforehand, but that's kind of like the idea. That's like the idea. And then when you get those constant updates and new things like the pooling or whatever, that's the test and learn piece, where new things are happening to, which sometimes may be quite small incremental changes, you know, when you see bug fixes on there as the new update. That's kind of important, because all those little changes make a massive difference to your competitive position. So you have to have a good strategy. You have to have good brand positioning. It's not an excuse. You can't just say, let's just test and find out, and put people in that kind of limbo position. And also, it's not sort of something which you should do in a way whereby you just get a rubbish answer back, because you, particularly in technology industries where you're trying to do stuff which is future focused and people don't get what it is you're trying to find out about, have really clear objectives about what you're testing for. And of course, the failure thing is something which you have to accept. You have to be able to say, actually, this isn't a failure, this is something we've learned from.
Yeah.
I think that's key. And empowering staff as well, because if you basically test stuff and then people can't do anything with it, it's a bit of a waste of time, because all people will do is try and fix the results so they get promoted so they can actually take decisions. So you know, at Expedia and at Monster, we have a mechanism whereby anyone can contribute an idea, and then the people who are actually experience and understand that area can test it out and figure out whether it's a good idea or not.
So anyone across any discipline can put forward
absolutely.
an idea for anything?
Absolutely.
So,
I mean, you could just say it gets pulled, we have a sort of tool, it gets priority ranked. So, I mean, it's not kind of complete chaos, but if someone said, look, I did this thing on the website today, I thought it was a bit rubbish and I think it could be better, and you look at it, actually, do you know what's a really good point? You can test it out, you're doing it in a fairly risk-free environment, so it actually encourages people to take ownership, encourages people to think creatively, and it encourages people to think about customers, which, you know, almost every marketing event you go to, if it's particularly about digital marketing, it drives me mad. People go, oh, it's not about the platforms, it's still all about the consumer. And ultimately, technology isn't an anathema to thinking about the consumer. It's an enabler to help you do better things for the customer that you're serving. If you put that at the heart of what you're doing, you're going to be in a good place.
Put the user first.
Exactly. Put the user first.
And I think what you said about having a proper business plan and long-term strategy, I think for Les and Peter in the front row, they are reassured by that. We heard, for any of you who are at yesterday's event, the first part of Les and Peter's research, there was a concern about short-termism. And so I think a worry about testing and learning is, are you constantly just doing small things? Is not what we're saying. We're saying there are the small test and learn, but equally, there are the biggest opportunities as well, and everything needs to be grounded in a proper business plan.
Absolutely.
As well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Expedia was a great example, and we had a team of people which cost tens of thousands to put together. They did all sorts of things which made hundreds of millions incrementally globally of extra revenue for that business, whether it was making it easier to check out, whether it was making it easier for people to find what they wanted. But the actual bigger ideas, they often were fewer and far between, and then you built those out, you tested into them, like with Gmail, but the two are not mutually exclusive to each other.
Exactly, I think that's a really important message. And for the agency people in the audience, Lawrence,
I know how much agency people like other agency people giving them advice, so I'm going to do this.
They love
Yeah, you love it.
I'm sure they'd give you a room if I asked.
I think two things. I think one is back to strategy. I think if a client has appointed an agency and they want an agency, that means they want some sort of outside perspective. Mm-hmm. They want to either have their own thinking validated or they want it challenged, but they kind of want a partner to develop a long-term strategy with. And I think that's what agencies can, whatever type you are or size, you can never forget that the moment you lose track of what that strategy is and how you can help clients get to it, then again, to use the word I've used a few times, you become a production company. You become someone who makes content of various different squares, of very different lengths that fits into platforms. Yeah. And then the second thing is that I think is to work out how you can put data into the heart of creativity, which sounds really easy, but it's really hard because so even an agency that's trying to, has developed a data team, creatives still ultimately believe that they should be making the creative leap or be given the foundations to make a creative leap, whereas sometimes actually I think data should lead it. So I think the advice would be, remember that you're strategic partners, and also make sure that you understand how far you can go down the data journey, and make some inroads into that, because I think it's really important.
Have you seen any wins when it comes to sort of data and creativity? Because it's something that you hear a lot about. There's not enough of them. But where have you seen success, either from your own experience or from the industry?
Oh, there's a bunch. I mean, I think it's. The Expedia example was quite a good one. I mean, there we gave the agency permission to come up with big ideas, bold ideas. I think Lawrence is absolutely right. The worst thing of all is when you kind of get the agency sort of second guessing you and think, it's a digital client. They won't want a lot of creativity. They won't want this. Absolutely, you want the strategy. Actually, absolutely, you want the big thinking. And I think there, I mean, the Travel Yourself Interesting campaign we did at Expedia, which picked up quite a few of the Effectiveness Awards, it was based out of traditional stuff, good, solid insights. But when we then took it a stage further, we didn't kill it by putting it, no offence to anyone who does this for a living, putting it into some of those rubbishing advertising focus groups where you get some, I don't like his hat type of feedback. And a lot of the methodologies, I mean, it's a good metaphor for test and learn, really. The thing which drives me mad is a lot of the research methodologies and advertising. I once ran 3 on an ad deliberately to prove the point, because they all came back with different results, is that they norm towards mediocrity. So the way in which they're structured, they norm towards mediocrity, particularly the cheaper ones. So actually what we did was we allowed the big ideas, but then we would test them, we would put them into controlled, low-risk environments, explore them, build them, make them better, and then back them. And I think that's where you can make the two things work together. And then you use the data to just keep refining and getting better at what you're doing.
Yeah. Great. So last week I was on holiday in the New Forest and I read this great article by a journalist, American journalist called Meg Conley. She asks her kids, don't worry, this is going somewhere. She asks her kids every night, how were you kind, how were you brave, and how did you fail? So we started asking our kids that every night. And what was really interesting, you have really interesting conversations about the day, but the one that they really struggled talking about was like how they failed, because they just couldn't understand why that was a good thing to talk about failure. So I'm going to ask you, can you give examples of how you have failed in your not in your life, but like in
My
a kind of
life.
work, in a work capacity.
Pull up the chair, everyone.
But something, yeah.
It's like my part.
Exactly. I think that there's kind of two things. I've desperately tried. The problem with having innovation in your job title is that at some point, someone in an agency, whatever agency you work at, and I have friends who do my role in other agencies, someone will come up to you and go, it's the campaign school report in about 3 weeks. We haven't got any funny digital things. Yeah. And so my fail in previously in my career was succumbing to that brief, which I've kind of learnt from and don't succumb to anymore. Which would be a tip for agency people is don't succumb to the digital bauble brief just because campaign wants to write something nice.
What did you call it? Digital bauble?
The digital bauble brief. I had a creative director who called it something a lot ruder than that. But that's.
I love it.
And then the other thing that would just be again back to the kind of the data bit. I think there are lots of agencies, including ours, who are starting to make structural inroads and change briefs around trying to bring the kind of oil and water, as it was once described to me, of kind of software people and creative people. And I think the biggest failure yet of certainly of my agency all of the time and of other agencies is not having quite cracked how to do that. So in patches we have people of very different disciplines working really well together, which is what I think digital agencies and digital businesses do really well. Yeah. And I think just not kind of giving up in the ongoing pursuit of making that work in a broader creative enterprise would be the failure that I would stick my hands up for at the moment.
On stage.
On stage. It's all my fault.
I think Monster certainly was guilty of this failure. A lot of digital businesses are, I think it was talked about short-termism. Often, I went to a panel once, it was a Marketing Society one, and I was with some people from traditional companies, and well, it's easy for you digital guys to change things. We're hundreds of years old, we're traditional. Actually, that's not necessarily true. I think with a lot of digital businesses, Expedia, Monster, they almost structure their business around a point in time on the internet. Sometimes they can become too short-term, too focused on the small ideas, too focused on the data, and that leads to inward-looking thinking, and then around the outside comes someone else who disrupts the category, your Airbnbs, your Ubers in our category, people like Indeed or LinkedIn, and they themselves then become complacent, someone else comes along, there's that sort of natural evolution. I think companies like Google, what they've done brilliantly is have that approach where they almost reinvent themselves. They're looking at new businesses, they're looking at new ways of doing things and keep an alert to that. So if you are practicing test and learn, you've really got to make sure you don't become too inward focused, and I think a lot of businesses make that mistake, including ones I've worked for. Yeah,
excellent. Right, now we have got a few minutes, so for anyone who wants to ask a question, then, are there microphones around? Oh, they are, they're there. So, any questions to the panel? Speak now, or forever hold your peace. Someone must have a question, come on. No questions at all? Last chance? Come on, Les. Oh, hang on a second. Microphone.
You were right. Is this on?
Yes.
You're right. We were thinking about short-termism in the context of test and learn. So how do you ensure... How do you structure a test that runs over, say, a 2-year time period? I mean, do you do that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's really hard because one of the things which a previous company I've worked for, they had this real dilemma because they, like, on the one hand, they knew that brand was important because all of the research that they did suggested that actually, in the travel sector, I was Expedia, if you're spending a lot of money, and a holiday is like the biggest purchase you're going to make on your credit card, then you kind of want to trust the brand which you're transacting with. And to be honest, if it's like £5, €5 more for the brand I've heard of versus the one I've never heard of, you're hopefully going to go for the one you've heard of. But the problem they had was they couldn't make this is what I was going to make earlier about sometimes too internally focused. They became so obsessed with kind of like the machine of the business and how that turned over. I kind of likened it to sort of sugar versus carbs, the quick rush of we do this now, we see the results straight away. That led to that short term. They couldn't get the brand piece to fix. And actually, you need to have a leader who is brave enough to understand these things. And we had a guy come in who said, look, do we believe in this or not? And actually, I think we all kind of agree that the reason we can't make it fit an Excel spreadsheet is not a good idea to prevent us from doing something, not a good reason to stop us doing something. So we kind of got that permission from the top, and we built the case. And yes, we started building models that looked at things over a much longer period of time, and then also pulling in third-party data, working with agency partners to look at stuff going back over time. And we did build a model around it, but it was one which was iterative, so it wasn't sort of fixed in what happened in the past is necessarily going to happen in the future. And ultimately, we were able to switch the thinking around from brand being a sort of an expensive luxury that one day we'll get around to afford to investing in, to actually over, I think we showed it was over a 2-year period, actually. We didn't almost need to argue beyond then. Over a 2-year period, we could show that a consistent brand investment actually built the base to a point where all the costs came down on a cost contact basis, and therefore it was a good thing even on the old Excel spreadsheet model. But you just kind of have to get that permission. You have to have a leader who understands it, I think, to make it work.
That sounds perfect, but did you do that by testing the effects of the brand or modelling the effects of the brand?
We did have testing going on within that. Yeah, there was modelling which took place, but it was more permission for the model to run over a longer period of time, because with a lot of the digital marketing stuff I found is that people expect the return in the same time frame as the activity takes place in. And it's really, I mean, a lot of this stuff's out there already, of course, in the world of econometrics. You know, most of you know this, the direct and the indirect effect. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but
Definitely with these two.
yeah, I mean, definitely. But with it really required a bit of work to persuade these guys that we can still use all of the models that you're using, but we just have to not look at them over this period of time, look at them over this period of time. And we had to build the arguments, get a good leader who backed us and believed in us, and then prove that it worked. And it's not perfect. And looking at the fact that they've cut their advertising budget, maybe they've gone back the other way again. But it is winning the argument ultimately.
Yeah, brilliant. Gentleman here.
Hi, Tim Holbrook from Barclays. Thanks very much, really interesting conversation. I wonder if you can just explain to me, because I didn't quite get it, and you said it twice, so it's obviously important. I get having really great insight in the creative brief, having really clear objectives, kind of what you want people to see, think, do, what you think the outcomes are. But you've mentioned technology and data driving creativity. Can you just explain to me in really simple terms what you mean by that? Because I don't quite understand it.
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Sorry, Lawrence.
So I think it's more about plotting where it fits across the whole process. So I think if you're a really good planner, then you still need an element of gut feel when you're writing a creative brief to get to work that will move people and do something. But I think you should use data. You should derive data from tools and analytics you've already got to better inform it. And then when you've put your first piece of work out, you need to design that work so that, again, it can be verified and tested by data. So we're in the middle of hopefully what will be a long-running recruitment campaign for the Army. And that the end line or the creative articulation for that was "Don't join the Army." And I remember when the guys went out to pitch for that they were vaguely terrified that they were going to the Army to say, our big idea is no one should join the Army. And they felt that it was brave and it was motivating and it confronted some problems. That came from gut feel, and then backed up by some real insight that we got from our data team about how consumers were thinking. What we've then done with that campaign for the last year is the audience we talk to has changed. We've identified a slightly different audience than we started off with. We've identified very specific life stages and even times of the week and times of the month, i.e. payday, that we should talk to them. And that will result in some change of tone of voice and creative. So to your point, I think someone has got to stand up and go, I've seen all the data and I've heard all the research, but I'm going to be brave and take a stand. And then the data then helps you, will hopefully have helped you make that decision in the first place, but then help you iterate to a better version of your vision that you had for a campaign. I think if you start purely with the rational and the scientific, that you end up with work that just doesn't move. And that's what I talk about, the combination of the two rather than data driving it.
That's a great example.
Somewhat answer your...
Yeah,
Good,
excellent,
okay.
thank you. Right, we're running out of time. So one last piece of advice.
One about generally or just about...
Generally, generally, whatever you want, Laura.
Yeah, Thailand's nice, isn't it? I would say just do it, because what's the worst that's going to happen?
Yeah,
really?
love it.
Yeah, I think it's do it, or it'll be done to you. It'll be done to you. If you take on the mentality, otherwise someone else will, and they'll disrupt you, and you'll end up being out of a job.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you both very much for your wisdom and your thoughtfulness, and for being brave. For those of you who are here for 2 days, there is actually a deep dive session on Test and Learn tomorrow afternoon with Unilever Foundry and also Kraft Heinz, so that's worth going to tomorrow afternoon. So what I will leave you with is, please go home tonight, reflect how you were kind, how you were brave, and how you failed. Thank you very much.